Good evening and welcome to another Pharaoh art stream with myself, Pharaoh, and my two wonderful co-hosts, Alexander Adams and Panama Hat. Good evening, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Diversity is our strength, comrade.
We have nothing to lose but our chains, and I adore the nation of Israel.
I'm still waiting for the Panama merch, the T-shirt with "I love the nation of Israel" on. I think it'd be so good.
Yes.
Well, first off, we need to point out this is Panama's third stream in the same day. It's a Herculean effort. Herculean effort.
Yeah, three and a bit hours with Turnip, 2 hours with Mark, and now here I am. This is what's got to happen. I'm here. I'm there. I'm all over the place.
You were going to say you were a YouTube influencer.
Yes,
that's what you were going to say.
Yeah, here I come. Here I go. This is the high flying life.
Thank goodness that Panama was not born in the Georgian era, as I imagine you racing around the different coffee houses of London, frantically debating with people and going from place to place.
Yeah, I'd be like Paul Revere on the horse, charging, riding from tavern to tavern to get in the latest on art, politics, history, literature. I'd be everywhere.
Exactly, and speaking of, I guess kind of legendary figures. I mean, I think one TV appearance, that's a one-off, but now we've had the double.
Yeah.
Adams. I would say you're a TV personality now. We are graced with, the hallowed, that membership. How do you feel like last week went?
It went okay. I didn't have quite enough time to sort of expand on my points. I had I had some boring talk about legislation that was enabling political activism in institutions, but it didn't seem quite the right discussion.
Listen to this modesty. No, come on, we need to be celebrated.
It was interesting because it was a lot more like bantery, I would say, than your first one. Because the first interview was with Doyle, wasn't it? And then the second one was with this other guy.
Steve M. Allen.
Yes, was he filling in then for Doyle, or was?
Yes. He was. Doyle was on holiday, but he will be back in the beginning of August when I shall be making a third appearance.
Oh my goodness, you're already booked in already. This is it.
Wow.
I told you, the regular slots. Come on.
Yeah.
Well, technically, it's part of the promotion of my my new forthcoming book, Artivism. The Battle for Museums in the Era of Postmodernism, published on the 2nd of August.
Look at that, and again, just a seamless.
This is another book this year. Another book. He's hitting those presses. Flying out of the.
We've got at least another 2 coming this year. Hold on to your trousers.
Stellar activity here.
Well, actually 3 more, because I'm involved in a book which Panama Hat has also contributed to, which we're hoping is going to hit the presses next month, which I shall be announcing and discussing.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm also imagining 2 things. Number 1, you kind of like using Amy to do all of your editing for you. That's her major job, basically, is just like she's frantically pulling all of your papers together.
Yeah.
As you fire them out throughout the night and then sleep through the day.
Absolutely, she is the Boswell to my Johnson. Yes,
absolutely. Amanuensis.
Yes, very good. Yeah.
Very good. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, it is wonderful to be in the presence of such illustrious guests, and today we're here to talk about criticism. And Hat, this was your kind of concept and idea, so maybe I'll throw it over to you.
Well, we had a kind of a talk about we were thinking, obviously on this channel we think about art all the time, and we sort of thought about, well, the art critic as we understand it sort of now, we sort of thought, well, where did that come from? Where does that begin to happen? Because you have, obviously, art has existed for pretty much as long as humans have existed, but when do people start critiquing art as a kind of societal thing, an intellectual thing, and when does art criticism kind of crystallize into its own thing? Why, why and when does that happen, and sort of what's the history of it? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? How do artists respond in their profession to the rise of the critic? And part of this as well is we're going to look at artists who kind of were encouraged throughout their life versus artists who were kind of always fighting uphill, who were kind of disliked by critics or by the public or by their mentors, or even by their peers, by other artists, who succeeded and who suffered. And this title image I put together a while back, and it's just I thought, because you have the I think Carl Spitzweig on the right there, it's a detail from a painting of his called "The Poor Poet," which is a piece that I've always very much liked. It's a sort of early 1800s poet lying on a mattress in a tiny garret room with an umbrella, trying to hold off leaks in the roof, trying to write poetry. And one of the saddest things about it is that he's actually burning his own work in the stove to keep warm, which is very sad. And then on the left there is, of course, the famous Hans Holbein the Younger painting, The Ambassadors. I basically just wanted to contrast the image of like a well-to-do, sort of rich, successful, influential man with the kind of the poor poet, sort of starving in the garret.
Fun fact: this is on the right. That's basically Panama Hats, but with a laptop on his chest there. Basically.
I do not use a laptop. I am a big fan of pen and paper still. So yeah.
Okay. Well, let's start off with discussions around the history of criticism. Now, I was trying to think what is the earliest examples of criticism we have. Can you hear me okay? No.
Yeah, the audio is not so great. You're sort of coming in and out, and there's a bit of buzzing.
Okay. Let me talk about my point, and then I will try and get a different set of headphones.
Okay.
And I wanted to start us off. What I thought was the earliest example I could think of, and that was actually in the Greek world. And I don't know how familiar. I know that you've been researching ancient Greek playwrights recently, but I don't know if you're familiar with some of the competitions they would have.
Yes.
As part of that.
That's right. If I remember correctly, the theatre of Dionysus had 12 seats specifically. There were 12 seats which were like reserved seats for particular members of the audience, and then everyone else would be at the back, basically. Oh. But in the kind of ground center, in the space in the middle, there, I think there were 12, which were special carved ones.
Yes, and in the same way that the Greeks had Olympic Games, they would often have these kind of kind of literary games as well.
Yes,
where plays would be presented and poetry would be presented, and there would be a competition basically. So there would be like three or four tragedies, 3 or 4 comedies, and you would have judges there to preside over and decide who the winner is. And certainly for the Olympic Games, they were carved into the stones. I think there are some carvings, but I think all of the kind of winners are recorded through posterity via writings at the time.
That's right. Yes.
For us, but I thought it was a really interesting early example of early criticism in the form of judges and competition.
Yes.
So
I mean, it's basically like the model of almost like the talent contest or the art competition, and one of the most famous participants was Aristophanes, who was a repeat winner. He won like 3 or 4 years in a row with his plays, which were all comedies.
Yes, and but I think what is interesting is that none of the kind of critics' names come down to us. We know the names of the playwrights and the winners, but we don't necessarily know who the judges are.
Yeah,
And
critics are forgotten.
but if it wasn't for them, they also mold and choose the artist. So that there is a weird power dynamic, I would say, between the critic and the artist, where the critic can guide, it can elevate, and it can destroy, but the artist is the one that will be immortalized forever. So it's kind of like it's a thankless job, but it's a very powerful one at the same time. You know, think of the power of those 12 judges they had. They had the power to raise up an unknown playwright if they so chose. But so at that moment they're very powerful, but in the kind of grand scheme of time, who remembers them? But should we move on through history? Where do you think is the kind of what we call kind of modern criticism? When do you think it comes in?
I'd have to actually ask Alexander. I think I want to hear his answer first.
Well, I would say that there are several starts of art history. So art history could start with Pausanias or Pliny the Younger, I believe, where they're just sort of simply talking about noted artists. Then, of course, you've got Vasari in 1550, who writes the first sort of collected biographies of modern artists. And that involves art criticism, although it's also to do with the stories of the artists and a general discussion about the value of different forms of art. I think art history itself as a genre is generally handed to Johann Winckelmann, German classics scholar, who wrote in the 1750s. So that's the starting of art history. Art criticism, of course, basically takes up from there, and it's basically people saying, is this artist as good as the greats of the past? So it's basically it's something that happens during the Enlightenment, and then you see it sort of accelerating during the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. I want to loop back to Vasari a second, because I think he's, in my mind, super important in the role of criticism. So his book, The Life of Artists, he basically kind of curates a selection of, I guess, kind of recently dead artists, current artists, as well, giving relatively chunky biographies. Like, I don't know, a chapter on each one. Is there about 40 artists? There's quite a range.
I think it goes up to about sort of 50 or so, because you do have some quite short ones, and then you also have like multiple ones where you've got the lesser known artists who tend to go together, or he mentions them in a biography of a more important artist. I think in the second edition it went up from 2 volumes in the first edition to 3 volumes in the second edition. So I think it goes up to about 50 or so, and that includes painters, sculptors. I believe there might be some architects as well. A couple.
Yeah. I think there's only 2. Now, what's interesting for me is that it's obviously a curated list, and he's seeing it from his, let's just say, Florentine viewpoint at the same time. So it's all the kind of like great Florentine artists in there.
Yes.
The kind of the Sienese don't get really a mention. The Venetians don't really get a mention.
Well, they're counted as secondary. They're used as an example of becoming too feminine, too emotional, and submitting to colore instead of disegno. So disegno is drawing, and that's the skill, that's the talent of the Florentines. But the Venetians are they're good, they're talented, but they're too feminine, they're too Eastern. They go with colore, color, which is what they're famous for, and things are fused in the school of Rome under Michelangelo and Raphael, and of course Leonardo, who was there briefly.
Yeah, good point. I forgot. I think Mantegna gets mentioned, doesn't he? In maybe edition,
he gets downgraded in the second edition. He's reduced because he doesn't fit into the pattern. Because he's Padua, which is sort of just like, which is close to Venice.
It's basically Venice. I call
So
it as well, Venetian
yeah,
silver.
so he doesn't quite fit, and then there's some sort of artists from the south as well who don't quite fit, because there's Antonello de Messina, who's from Sicily. Great artist, doesn't fit the pattern, so he kind of gets overlooked. And that's deliberate because Vasari has got a pattern that he's got a story that he has to tell, so he has to leave out the parts that don't fit.
Yeah, it's interesting, and these kind of ideas of trying to map out what the past was like and what our present is involves curation. It involves criticism as well, because he's selecting different artists to fit into this narrative he's trying to pull. I mean, like you said, he's pretty brutal with some of his criticism as well with some of the artists, which is quite amusing. It's a great read. It really brings things alive today. But I think it's a really important book because I think it then gets picked up in the Enlightenment, as you mentioned, in terms of comparison, because it brings the lives of artists to life for people. It's not just not just their work; it's who they are as well. So I do think that it's fundamentally important for understanding criticism,
and it does influence the reputation of artists. So it does, basically, I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened without him, but ever since he wrote his biographies, then obviously Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo are seen as the big three of the High Renaissance, and they have been sort of considered the apex of the Renaissance. And you get, and you do get a slightly distorted impression. You don't get to see the other regions of Italy. You get sort of Venice as in a secondary position behind Florence. It had a great deal of influence on the way that art history was written and how art criticism was written afterwards.
Yeah, the high Gothic gets ignored as well. Basically,
yeah.
Maybe Mantegna, you could say, is anyway. Very, very interesting. I'm going to posit another important thing for the rise of criticism, and that's the printing press.
Yes, definitely.
Because a critic needs to be enabled by media. Really, would you say? What's your thoughts, Hat, on?
I would actually say that the printing press is, of course, important, but I think that the printing press might be less important than the advent of the newspaper and the kind of literate class. Because I'm thinking, for example, of the circles that Dr. Johnson used to kind of be in, where they would kind of print newspapers for each other. Like the sort of the people that were writing them very much knew who they were writing for. The kind of newly literate the public, as we would understand it. Of course, nowhere near what we would consider to be the reading public now, but the kind of the circles in London where they began to discuss art. I mean, for example, I know that Joshua Reynolds was part of the club, along with Johnson and Boswell, Edmund Burke, Goldsmith. They were all there, and a lot of paintings and things were discussed. And it's interesting because you don't really get like academic criticism as such. You just get remarks. They say, I thought it a very fine piece, and I thought that the use of the particular color here could have been a bit murkier, but anyway, whatever. Sort of little bits of remarks like that, which kind of begin to build up, I think, criticism, because of course at that point literary criticism is in something of a sort of golden age. And I think art criticism is beginning to come out of the woodwork as well at that point.
So maybe talk through some of the literary criticism, because again, obviously that's a different strand entirely.
Yeah.
What's happening during the age of Johnson? Are people kind of doing reviews of other works, etc., in a quite a formal manner, or is
people are kind of writing treatises on each other's work or upon historical works? For example, that's when Shakespeare criticism, I think, really takes off. People talking about which of the plays are good, which are bad. How well to perform it. What Shakespeare meant by certain things. What did he mean by this character? What was his religion? What was his philosophy, and this kind of thing. And then, of course, this goes to other works. So there's a huge literary schism between Johnson and various others because of the James Macpherson Ossian poems, which are purported to be ancient Scottish epic verses, and Johnson said, "Look, there's no way these could be ancient epics because you make reference to like modern tools and equipment and all these words that didn't exist back then and all sorts of things." And this was a huge war between people who insisted that Ossian was genuine old Scots and Johnson who said it was a fabrication and things like that. So of course,
Johnson was proved to be correct.
He was proved to be correct. Yeah, quite.
Just to finish off,
quite obviously, quite obviously when we read it now, yes, there were criticisms of poetry, and there were great discussions of the poets of the last century, of Marvell and the metaphysical poets, and poor old Alexander Pope, who never seemed to get away with anything and was always being maligned or dismissed or criticized here and there, and things like that. So yes, it kind of literary criticism, I think, had existed in a certain way, but the 1700s and the kind of Johnsonian era are what makes it a kind of formal thing. That's when the convention is developed. That's when the kind of the different styles, the way that you talk about a book, what exactly you're trying to get out of literary criticism, what's the aim of it. And I should also point out that it's not strictly criticism as we would understand it now, as in like you're writing a critique of a book. It's more like a kind of objective thing where you are trying to divine certain qualities out of it, and if along the way you think an author has failed in a particular area, then you bring that up, basically. Far more lively than modern quote literary criticism, which is mainly just people writing spurious, largely sort of uninformed takes about things. But that's just modern universities. So
just two things off the back of that. First thing I want to mention around that kind of 1700s period is the fixation about understanding of taste as well. So basically there's a lot of curiosity as to what is good taste, and an obsession with people trying to find it. Even Adam Smith goes on to write an entire little thing about a couple of essays on taste as well. And it's this trying to ascertain what is good. And so you have this idea of tastemakers, people who kind of, again, it's kind of like a take on the kind of this proto-critic role as people who say this is good and then everyone follows them. Basically, you've obviously had that in fashion for a long period of time, where when the right people wear the right clothes. Are you familiar with the Duchess, the Duchess of Marlborough? She's
Georgiana.
Yeah, she for example is super famous for whatever style she would wear.
Yes, that's right.
Everyone else would follow at the same time, as an example of a proto-influencer as well. But
that's true. And this actually, again, the reason the period is so important is because right before this, in the early 1700s, David Hume, when he's writing about no. Is it David? I'm sure it's. I may be confusing a piece of philosophy by Hume with Burke here, but I'm pretty sure it's Hume. He basically comes up with the principle that taste is best decided upon out of necessity by a group of learned expert critics.
That was indeed Hume. You're correct.
That was Hume. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Well,
and because Burke also wrote the treatise on
Beautiful and Sublime.
I'm the Beautiful. Yes. Yeah. I thought I was confusing the two, but yes, Hume says that taste has to be guided by expert critics, and that you can't leave it up to the layman, basically, because laymen don't know anything.
Well, they both published their essays in 1757. So On Taste was one of the essays in Hume's collection, and then Burke published on The Beautiful and the Sublime in 57. He published his first edition in 57, then his 59 edition, second edition, was basically a response to the Hume piece, which had come out before he was able to change his first version. You have obviously I've been preparing the long-awaited Foundations of Aesthetics, which is now reaching its final stage. Touch wood. So you have this discussion about this division between some people who think that taste is something that can be decided upon by any person and that it is sort of innate. It comes from principles that are within them that are unchanging. Then there are other people who say, well, no, to actually cultivate you need time and education and opportunity to cultivate your taste in order to become discriminating and therefore to make good judgments. And so therefore it's Hume who says, well, not everyone's got the time or the faculty to develop this good taste. Burke seems to say, everyone will do it, if they're exposed to it. But Hume says, no, actually, if you're going to create a canon, this needs to be done by people who have the education and the knowledge and the passion to do it. And these will necessarily be men of aristocratic background because they have these opportunities. Yeah.
It's worth connecting with Reynolds again as well, because this is the period where the Royal Academy is formed, and obviously Reynolds is an important figure with the creation of it. And obviously they would have exhibitions on a yearly basis where people could submit paintings, and certain ones would be selected, and there was a hanging committee. And I really like the idea of the hanging committee as a form of criticism as well. Have you ever been on a hanging committee, Alex?
I could think of a few people I'd like to hang. No, I haven't. But you're right. Yes, being a jury or a hanging committee for an open submission exhibition is obviously a good way of honing your taste and applying discrimination to a body of work that's being submitted. I will actually be involved with a prize. Just today I was contacted about judging an art prize, so I would be doing some of that. But yes, you're a sort of a proxy art critic when you're part of this sort of committee.
Yeah, I would call it a type of criticism. I guess that's an interesting question. Should the critic, what is the defining characteristic of a critic as opposed to a judge, I guess?
I would say it's articulation. It's articulation and the preservation of your opinions and judgment. With a judge, you're basically saying, well, this one looks better than this one, or this one fits our remit better, or this would look best in our exhibition. And you don't necessarily have to explain it. And the explanation is not generally made public. The jury don't generally, apart from commending winners of particular prizes, they don't generally explain their thinking. They might sign up to some sort of group statement, but it's usually quite woolly. Whereas the critic has to articulate why a particular works of art are good, how that discrimination is made, and it's written down in an articulate form which is intelligible to not only the goers of the exhibition, but also people who will not see the exhibition. So you have to kind of give a sense of what the artworks that you're talking about. So obviously in the early days when art criticism was written, there was not generally an illustration. There was later on, you get sort of you get engravings and line cuts and woodblock cuts and so on. But at the time when art criticism starts, a lot of it was verbal description. So that obviously honed the critic as well. So I would say that's the main difference between a judge and a critic.
Hat, any thoughts on the defining characteristics of criticism?
It's a difficult question to really pin down. I think it's as Alexander said, it's less trying to judge works between them, and I think it's more about trying to assess the value of a particular work as opposed to kind of comparing. I think comparison is a kind of alien form of criticism. I think that you've got to be able to basically take a work and go, well, why is this good or why is this bad, and what is it? Can we divine what it's trying to tell us?
Interesting. Yeah.
Gio is in the chat, and he, our friend Gio,
Hello, Gio.
The artist and commentator and art personality of YouTube. He says the final artistic act to destroy everything that exists. So it's a little bit on the edge, but I think that's what we expect from Gio. Hello to Gio.
That's a very kind of futurist argument to art, isn't it?
just putting in my own two pence. I think a critic has to have a voice. I think that's a really good point around the judge versus the critic, and tied to that a platform as well. And that's why I do think things like the newspaper is the quintessential medium of certainly the art critic. I think there's a definite differentiation between the literary critic, which seems to me to be more formal and academic, as opposed to the artistic critic, because due to its nature, it is always going to be more verbose, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And then I also think that I would agree with Hume. You need to have a certain level of expertise, although again, criticism and taste is something that cannot be trained at university, but something that is lived through someone's life, which again is an interesting position today in our world of rank credentialism. I bet there
and democracy.
Yes, exactly. I bet there's like an art criticism degree or something like that, so you can get your kind of
not per se. You'd think that they'd have cooked up something like that.
Oh, no, there'll be a poly.
Not at the moment. Maybe I should start offering a course on
it. Yes.
A qualification. There's too many critics as is, Alexander.
Foundations of art criticism. When?
Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Anything else to say about the kind of 1700s critic hats before we kind of go on through the time?
No, I think that's more or less it.
Okay, so I'm just trying to think of who the most prominent critic during that time period would be, in like a formal way. Any suggestions?
I would say you've got people like, this is a bit later, but you've got people like Baudelaire. So Baudelaire is very important for this is obviously the 1840s and 1850s. So this is quite clearly later on. But he's especially important because he links the literary world and the artistic world. He wrote reviews of the salons in Paris. And was an innovator. And you talked earlier about critics being forgotten, but the artists that they're criticizing living on. It's not always the case. I mean, the famous one is The Painter of Modern Life by Baudelaire, which was written in the in 1863. It was serialized in 1863. And the main artist he talks about is not Manet, although he does mention Delacroix. His main artist is an artist called Constantin Guise. So good luck looking him up on the internet. I mean, I'm being a bit cheeky. He's not completely unknown, but he's certainly not a major figure, and he's certainly less famous than Baudelaire.
I think what does strike me is that the 1700s doesn't have that kind of communal garden critic, let's just say, and it tends to be more of this kind of academic aesthetic critic, isn't it? Really, that they're kind of more formal. It's your Burke or a Hume. As we kind of go into the 1800s, I think that changes, and I'm going to say for a couple of reasons why. Firstly, is like you mentioned the salon, and I just got me thinking it's part of the growth of the modern critic is the need to review things, if that makes sense. Art was previously the preserve of, patrons and the high elite. Like, I'm trying to think, there wouldn't be that many galleries. You would have private collections, wouldn't you? You'd have the Queen's collections in the 1700s, etc.
Yes.
And you'd go to your friend's house and have a look around, etc. But there wasn't formal galleries in the same kind of way. Now, come the 1800s, you've got these regular salon appearances. You've got the Royal Academy kind of really kicking into to sway. It's like a national event where everyone wants to find out what the latest pictures and who the greatest artists are. And I'm going to say, this is going to be an unpopular opinion, with the rise of the bourgeoisie and the middle classes, criticism gets increased prominence. What would you say if I were to say that criticism is fundamental to the bourgeois part of society, because they're so obsessed with their place in society, therefore they need ciphers to tell them?
I think it's to do with, like, for example, when I think of this, the images that are conjured in my mind are like 1800s Paris with like newspapers printing like shots at different artists, and uproars being caused over this salon or that salon, and this painting's too controversial and this is shocking, and the press are going to have an outrage and people are going to burn down the salon and all that. Like I think it came out of a kind of because all of a sudden it's not just a bunch of people in private collections looking at each other's art who are just few. All of a sudden, art is now open completely to the middle and even in some cases the working classes, right? I mean, and so I think it's because, for example, you've got someone like Baudelaire, who was a poet as well as a critic and a sort of small-time philosopher. So he's kind of his I would argue that the criticism he left us with is more of a kind of treatise on art in general. It's not the kind of weekly Parisian critic columnist who's writing about this week's, the paintings went on show this week are this and this, and this one's good, this one's bad, this one's terrible. Where you kind of get critics who make a living not just for saying whether art is good or bad, but for doing it in a way that's entertaining to read, like critics who are famous for being brutal, or for having people who read the review for the sake of reading the review, not really for the art. So I think I'd agree that yes, it is integral to the kind of bourgeois world, because it gives them a sense of engagement. If you take all that away, if you take away the kind of all the ink and paper that gets put out on art, then you're basically back to people who own art and people who can put on exhibitions of art, and all of a sudden the kind of bourgeois expert on art who could do so without ever leaving his armchair isn't there anymore, because he hasn't got all the material.
Yeah, I would say that there's two critical things. One is the rise of the importance of the salon in the 1780s and 1790s in Paris, because that's when you see the emergence of neoclassicism, which was expressly opposed to the supposed decadence of the ancient regime. And then, of course, you had the revolution, which then opened up the royal collection to the public. It became public property. And so you had people being able to go to the Louvre. Well, it wasn't the Louvre at the time, but the Tuileries or whatever. They were able to access the royal collection. So that obviously stimulated a lot of discussion, because people could see examples of famous art that had only been simply described, or they'd seen it in reproduction prints. And then, of course, I think that just the journalistic imperative of having newspapers and having pages to fill meant that you got a lot of criticism of all sorts of things, like book reviews and art reviews, as well as news and sort of public announcements and so forth, and sort of court news and stuff. Legal court news. So all of that was going into the newspapers, and newspapers had a voracious appetite for material. So I think obviously art criticism was just simply another part of the fuel that they consumed.
I wonder if this kind of juxtaposition of like fast news traveling but slow actual traveling. So again, if you're living in a small town in the north but you're well-to-do, you can still read the newspaper and hear from your favorite critic about a show in the big cities, and get an opinion on it as well.
Yes.
I do wonder though if critics, again, if I were to kind of criticize criticism itself, going back to this idea of it's kind of fuel for the bourgeoisie. I feel like a lot of what Carlyle talks about in terms of respectability and attacking respectability, is against the critic, because the critic sort of establishes the status quo in some ways. Or again, and you see this today where I've heard people kind of parrot back views from the Guardian or the Telegraph critic. What's the Guardian guys called? With little.
Was it Valdemar Januszek? Is it?
Yes,
no, Jonathan Jones. Does he still?
Oh yes, Jones is who I was thinking of. Yeah, exactly. And they'll just repeat back, exactly what he says. So you have this idea of the critic sets the status quo and locks us into his reality at the same time. And any more comments about the 1800s and critics? Because I have more to say, but.
Well, I would pose a question to the two of you, starting with Alexander. Is that, do you think that the rise of criticism was ultimately a good or a bad thing from the point of view of the artist? I'm talking about the kind of mass, sort of Parisian-style newspaper critics here.
Well, I think obviously you've got a problem with fashion following, but I think that existed anyway, and I think that was. In a way, you could say, well, okay, with the rise of art criticism meant that artists were more beholden to following fashions, and that sort of there was a rapid turnover of fashions. But then I think that was happening in court culture as well, because I think you find that the way court culture changes, that sort of promulgates changes of style and changes of emphasis and changes of intellectual content and so forth, and even changes of artists. There are certain artists who just go out of fashion and people just stop buying them, even though they might adapt their work. They go out of fashion and they just get dropped, and you'll find that happens today. But I think that also happened in the sort of pre-criticism days as well. Less so, I think, in sort of ancient times when styles were progressing much more slowly, so you could live out your entire lifetime, you could do your career's work, and you wouldn't be sort of cut off at the knees, as it were, when you were 50 or something, because there was a change in style. I think that you would still be able to get work, even if that meant moving to maybe a slightly more parochial part of Greece or the Italian alliance in sort of Roman times.
Just on that, I've often thought that there are these kind of fashion cycles, but they have massively increased since the 1800s. So again, we can see it most marked in our lives. Every 10 years or so, there is kind of like quite big movements in fashion, and actually, it's only been the last 20 years or so that we've kind of been locked into similar styles. But for example, you've got the difference between the 50s and the 80s is very marked, right, in terms of how everyone dresses. But that's true for the whole of the 19th century as well, where there are some big changes. Again, if you go from the kind of high Victorian to the mid and to the early, it's three hugely different looks and styles and cuts of clothes. But before that, it's much slower cycles. I think it's about 20 years during the 19th century. It's 10 years during the 20th century. But before that, it would be 50 to 100. And if you look at, I'm particularly interested in medieval fashion, and yeah, you could have an entire lifetime where everyone would wear something very similar. And I do wonder if the critic again is one of the catalysts for that, because it encourages fashion and it encourages chasing after social status through liking certain things, etc. So, but to kind of defend the critic again, the critic still has a place for, like I said, for sculpting and guiding both the artists and the people who are reading his work. And I wanted to obviously bring up one of my personal heroes, John Ruskin, the famous art critic from the 19th century.
The venerable Ruskin.
Yeah, and just to give a little overview about him for those who don't know, he is the son of a wine merchant, um, but someone with very, I'd say, kind of aristocratic sensibilities and spirit in his life. He was famous for writing a series of books called Modern Painters, where he talked about um, like painting in his present, and also included a variety of kind of aesthetic philosophy, and also criticism as part of that, where he famously kind of highlighted Turner as a great artist that was being overlooked at the time. And Ruskin was very young when he wrote the first Modern Painters. I think he's in his 20s, and it was a huge success out of nowhere. I think he was actually just out of Cambridge or something like that, and it was a huge success. And very soon it put Turner on the mark. So I thought, just in terms of one person that would have been forgotten if it wasn't for the critic, Turner could have been that person, could have ended up penniless in some kind of seaside somewhere.
Yeah.
Ruskin goes on to have a very illustrious career, talking about a variety of subjects, but also his kind of criticism of, I guess, kind of historic works. Again, it kind of goes into the kind of art history section with his triple book, The Stones of Venice, looking at the different stages of Venice's architectural history. But again, all of it's a platform for understanding kind of current art. In terms of like his more kind of like we're talking about like criticism of a specific art show, I don't believe he actually did that many individual bits of work, but he quite he didn't have like a column in the Times or whatever, but he quite famously wrote a letter to the Times supporting the Pre-Raphaelites when they first were exhibiting. I don't know if you guys know about this, but they weren't connected beforehand. Apparently, Holman Hunt had read some of his works beforehand, but he quite publicly said, "These guys are really good. You should check them out," because they were getting slammed pretty badly by the press during their first showings. I think their first launch at the Royal Academy was in '51, and none of them sold any paintings, and they got terrible reviews by the press as well, by some of the kind of major critics of the time. So again, without Ruskin's help, the Pre-Raphaelites, I don't think, would have taken off in the same kind of way. Although I think ideologically they were quite separate. And of course, I won't go through his full life, but I did want to bring up something that a piece of work that Alex did on a specific little incident that I'll bring up now later on in his life. So let me just. We won't go through the full article, but maybe if you want to give us a bit of a rundown. And it's the Ruskin-Whistler incident.
Ah, yes. And I know that we're going to get some flack for this from Mr. D. Because
what's his view?
Well, he is staunchly pro-Whistler. And I believe that Ferro is generally more pro-Ruskin, if I'm not correct. If I'm not incorrect there.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've heard these two get quite heated in certain mornings when they were discussing it. I would love the next time the two of them are in a VC together, I will definitely bring this up just to watch the battle unfold again.
Like the Blue Touch plate. Well, that's quite appropriate for a painting about an exploding rocket. So if you go, so if people would like to read the whole article, it's on Alexander Adams art.substack.com. You can read it for free, by the way. All the articles are free at the moment. So, and you can go there, and it's basically, I describe what happened when in 1878. So there was a big furore because Ruskin had accused Whistler, who was a sort of progressive painter, if you'll pardon that. I mean, politics aside, he was influenced by Japanese art. He was a tonalist, so he was by no means a realist. He was not a Gothic. He was not sort of interested in the Gothic. He didn't like the detail that Ruskin was advocating. Exactly the differences between Whistler and Turner, I think, is kind of interesting. But anyway, I don't think we'll get into that here, because I think that's worth a stream on its own. But anyway, Whistler exhibited this painting, and Ruskin famously described it as being the artist flinging a pot of paint in the face of the audience.
Okay. I got to stop you there. Because you got to hear the whole quote, because it's such a great, it's such a great destruction. On a second, I need to.
So is it Ruskin takes down Whistler with facts and logic, laser eyes?
It is. It's, the whole thing's a little bit awkward, because he's obviously best friends with Burne-Jones, who's also exhibiting. I believe it's at the Dulwich Picture Gallery, isn't it?
No, I think. Let's have a look.
Thomas Carlyle as well, I believe, wasn't it?
Yes, Whistler painted Carlyle. Very
that's
good.
right.
Yes.
Arrangement in black and grey #2, isn't it? And then,
yes.
and then Whistler's mother is #1, I think. If I'm not wrong.
Correct. Yes, they were paired. They were sort of pendant paintings. I'm busy scanning my own article to find out facts, which is never a good sign.
Okay, here we go. Here's the quote. I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Total, absolutely wrecked. Whistler.
It was exhibited at the Grosvenor Gallery, so this was like a commercial gallery. Right. This was a commercial gallery in 1877.
Yeah. Okay, so the first cannon volley of the battle is discharged.
And Whistler was by no means a Cockney; he was an American.
He's like anglicized.
Like T.S. Eliot.
But basically, he ends up suing him, doesn't he?
So Whistler sues him because this is basically Ruskin, an established critic, imputing the professionalism of an artist, it's insulting him in public. So Whistler felt like he had to do something about this, because this was basically saying that you're committing fraud here by offering shoddy goods, as it were. And this was a constant critique of the Impressionist painters. I think I mentioned it in our Degas stream, where Degas was and the other Impressionists were imputed with failing to uphold professional standards by not finishing their pictures. They were turning in unfinished work and exhibiting it as if it were finished, and that this was sort of deceit. This was an insult. It was a lack of seriousness. It was damaging the craft.
Do you chaps think this is a valid criticism of the artworks?
It depends. It depends what standards you're applying. If you're applying the old standards that Ruskin was applying, yes, probably it was accurate. But then you've also got to look at what Turner was doing. He was painting quite loosely at the time, so I mean,
but it's the money, though. It's the money. And here's the thing: what you need to understand the context of this is that Whistler was charging 200 guineas for a fully finished one of his other paintings. Let me just bring up some of Whistler's other work a second, so you get an idea. Whistler is a good painter. He is an excellent painter. Look at this. Symphony in White. Some of his women are astoundingly beautiful right here. He would charge 200 guineas for this, right? He can paint. But Ruskin's point is that he was charging 200 guineas, which is equivalent of almost £300,000 in today's money, for something of considerably less time, effort, and value. Now, to Whistler's point, he says, I've charged that much because it was a lifetime's knowledge. This is actually an economics question, more than a criticism question.
Interesting.
should people? Okay, I'm sure you're familiar with the economics, labor theory of value versus not discussion, and essentially, the Austrian school basically says people pay what they pay for art, and I would basically agree with that. People will pay whatever they think is valuable, but here's the question: should people pay for an equivalent item from the same artist who only a year before would produce something like that? So, what I'm saying is that it's relatively for Whistler, it's an inferior product at the same time because he's put a lot less effort into the work, charging exactly the same amount.
How do we know there was less effort in the work? Because for example.
He admitted it in the trial that it took substantially less, and you just like something like this would literally take like half a year to do, maybe depending. I guess with Whistler's style, it's a bit looser, so we're talking 3 or 4 months. I mean, dude, come on.
Gio and Amy are sniping you from the chat. They're not impressed. They're on Team D, I'm afraid.
There's uproars here.
I'm not saying that the labor theory of value is correct. It's more like from a philosophical perspective. Should you pay an artist? So say for example, the same artist has produced 2 pieces of work, right? The same artist in the same year. One is, one is substantially more expensive than the other. Anyway.
Well,
what I'm trying to say is it's an economics question, right? Is what he's trying to point out here, and then Whistler's saying this is a libel issue.
All I would have to say is that if I was a patron of Whistler, and I had previously paid however much it was for that painting of the woman, I think I would still be willing to pay good money for this because basically. You're paying for, I think, the kind of name and the reputation of the artist that he's built up on previous works. And he's saying now, well, look, even if it took less time to do, I found a new way of representing form, of representing light, of representing, of painting something like this, even if it technically took less effort as such. Then it took less time, it took less work. But I think the what they've actually represented is still beautiful, even if it has that kind of what you might call unfinished. I wouldn't personally use the word, but I know what you're saying. The kind of unfinished aspect to it. I think the quality of it still stands though.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm distracted because the children of Bristol are sacrificing their children to Moloch outside.
Yes. Bristol is having its usual Saturday night ceremony to Baal.
Sorry, I would just conclude this discussion by just think of the investment value.
Ooh.
Ooh. I'm being cheeky. I don't really.
Sorry. Goldman Sachs.
All I'm saying is it's literally this viewpoint is how you've ended up with someone like the Jeff Koons of this world churning out artwork and whatever people pay for basically. But is
that like saying that Ezra Pound is responsible for Rupi Kaur?
I don't know.
or that the girl that read that like terrible thing in the inauguration.
No, it's a totally separate thing. It's okay. I think there is definitely something. I think we need a middle ground ultimately, like philosophically, between this idea that you should pay any money for any object, depending if you like it or not, because it has severe consequences to the art market. And again, like I think there's a difference between reality, which is people will end up paying whatever they want to. I accept that as a fact, but should people do that is the question. And as an art buyer, how should you rate the price of objects? I think there's an interesting question there, and I, for one, think that there's a danger by just saying you can pay whatever you like. But I want to go back to this specific point around the trial. So basically, Ruskin lost the trial to Whistler, but they gave Whistler only like 2 shillings or something like that. It was like no cash back, so Whistler was heavily affected. But in my mind, you can read the. I don't even think that criticism is that bad. Do you know what I'm saying? Calling him a coxcomb, calling him like he's throwing a pot of paint on the wall. It's really not that bad. But the fact that he lost, in Ruskin's mind, it was the moment of the end of criticism, because the critic should be free to say whatever he likes. He should be able to call people coxcombs.
So Ruskin actually lost that trial.
He lost it. Okay. And he basically retired from public criticism after that point. He became like a bit of a recluse. It really affected him mentally, and he basically said, "Look, criticism is dead from this point, because legally we've drawn a line in the sand, and apparently if you insult someone's painting and they get offended by it, look at this absolute snowflake Whistler, soy Whistler." Soy Boy Whistler takes a little bit of criticism from a great master, doesn't like it, and then basically he has ruined criticism permanently. And again, even today, those libel laws are still live. So, that's in place.
So, are you saying that if Alexander Adams wrote like a scathing review, the artist could actually sue him for libel?
If you said it on the GB News, I bet you'd get. I bet you get, because part of libel is.
I'd get my own show.
Yeah.
Well, basically, I'm not sure about that.
Another hamper. Sorry.
I mean, you're probably more of a legal expert, but the whole point of libel is it's preventing sales and it's damaging your reputation. So essentially, people don't care when it's someone who doesn't have a big voice. I'm not saying you don't have a big voice. Alex, by the way, just in advance now. But I'm saying if you said something like that on the GB News with a big circulation, I can guarantee you would get done in for libel by some of the bigger guys. So we're living in an age where criticism is dead because of this trial in England.
Okay.
That's my viewpoint. Ruskin did nothing wrong. Whistler, I love Whistler. I like the work. But
hashtag Team Ruskin.
It's a question about criticism itself. What are the defined boundaries? What the criticism say?
Okay. I will say this much. I agree with Farrow in that I don't think this court case should have happened. I don't think that Whistler should have won it. I think that critics should be able to say things that are legal, even if they are hurtful. So I'm with Farrow on this. By the way, Lundberg is saying F for his birth town, so I guess that he means Bristol. And I bet you that Lundberg loved this stream so much that if it was monetized, he would give you a super chat, but we wouldn't be able to tell AA.
Okay. Anyway, that was an impassioned cry.
I also just want to conclude with I agree that the libel law. I actually had a misunderstanding here. I should know because I did some work on these back in the day, but I agree that the libel laws that mean that you can sue a critic over essentially a bad review is wrong. That shouldn't be a supported principle. Criticism should be free.
Technically, you can say anything you like as long as it isn't libel, which is actually knowingly telling a falsehood in order to damage someone's.
It's essentially libel law's messed up though, because what it basically translates as, though, Alex, is that anyone who's got the checkbook big enough will be able to kick up enough stink in the law courts. That's what modern libel means.
This is the point I was going to raise, is that from say a sort of barrister's perspective, the thing is that, as you say, if I was an artist and somebody sued me, they wrote a bad review and I took them to court for libel, basically you're going on a wing and a prayer that it can stick. The courts will uphold it, even if it's not strictly libel. Basically, if you can, as you said, if you can keep paying a lawyer to badger the court into saying that it's libel, you'll come out on top. So do we know the specifics of the trial? So who sided with who in terms of the notables of that time? Do you know?
Well, Burne-Jones sided with Ruskin, but he had to be super cagey about it because he was literally like co-exhibiting with Whistler at the same time. But again, it was just decided by 12 random people who had no idea about art criticism whatsoever.
I think didn't Wilde side with Whistler? I think.
Not surprised. Absolute subversive. Remove Wilde.
Yes. All of this is covered in my forthcoming Foundations course, by the way.
Indeed. So yes. Okay. So where does that leave us then for this discussion?
Maybe quickly, just to complete the history. 20th century criticism. I don't know if you've got any, like a quick guide to that before we go into your little case study, Alex.
Oh, okay. Well, you've got the rise. I mean, you've got the rise of specialist art magazines and journals in sort of the 1880s and 1890s. You do get art criticism in newspapers still continuing and still being significant. You're also seeing things like the vanguard movement of the New York school, the abstract expressionists in the 30s and 40s, was largely facilitated by art critics and cultural critics in low circulation magazines, cultural magazines, who went on to work for slightly higher profile cultural magazines. And they sort of decisively won the day, where there was this sort of battle between the regionalists, who were sort of more traditional, and then there was the abstract expressionists. Also, you'll find that the WPA, the Works Projects Administration, which was set up by our friend Roosevelt.
Oh dear.
As part of the New Deal, that gave prominent positions, administrative positions, to progressive artists, to modernist artists, who helped out in turn their modernist friends and channeled funding to them. So there's an interesting economic angle as to why the School of New York swung towards abstraction and modernism rather than sort of the traditionalism that you find with Hart Benton, and also interesting artists like Tamara de Lempicka, who went trad in the 1940s, but fashion went the other way, and then she tried to catch up with fashion by becoming an abstract painter, and she'd already blown her cred by then, so no one was interested, so she stopped painting.
That's sad.
Yeah.
And then I guess kind of like we've got modern criticism today, which is, I can only describe it, an open cesspit and sewage of stupid people with terrible ideas and opinions, apart from the shining light that is it, Alexander Adams, the UK's most prominent,
the premier
art critic.
Probably the busiest art critic. Yes.
Well, there you go. I mean, you're in. The people want you. They want your art criticism. I mean, this is the thing. And also, I think a special shout out must go to the Ferro Channel. The kind of silent engine of online discussion around art. You know, it's we're the only ones out here taking it seriously. So.
Oh well, also a nod to Geo at Giant Art Productions as well.
Yes.
Who would win in a fight between you and Jonathan Jones, do you think? I'm just wondering. That's
Let's see what he looks like.
It's different weight classes, mate. He's much bigger than I am. Come on.
Really?
He's a chunky chap, and so is Valdemar.
He's a chunky.
He's a chunky critic.
He looks quite chunky, but he also looks sort of wheezy. You know, he looks like it's a lot of sort of like beer and chips.
I believe. So. We're getting into libel territory here, I'm afraid. Well, slander territory.
I reckon I reckon you are fitter and stronger than this guy. Although he does have a sort of like pub bruiser look to him, so maybe he's got like secret strength. I don't know.
No, I've got my money on Alexander.
I think I want to see him fight.
I would pay. Gio
Gio
would win. Gio would win for sure. Fist of Fury, that's what they call him.
Yeah.
Right. Let's go into the
someone's asking. Yeah, Vingol is asking. Do we know that Gio's in the chat? Yes, we know that Gio's
in the chat. Friend Gio is down there.
Friend of the channel. Friend of ours. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're all fans of Gio, so there's no animus here. Yep.
Okay.
That's a beard.
I mean, it's a great beard. So talk me through this little comparison / incident that you pulled together.
Yes, so we're going to look at 3 artists who had very different critical art receptions. Well, 2 of them had very similar ones, and one had quite a different one. So first one is Meissonier, French sculptor and military painter. He's best known for, if you'd like to go to the next image, so basically for academic realism. He's a salon painter, worked in the 19th century. So you've got to remember, he's working at the same time as the Impressionists. So at the same time, Monet's doing his haystacks, and Pissarro is doing his sort of pointillist, sort of proto-pointillist style. A bit later, you've got Meissonier. He's doing these academic paintings, largely of military subjects. He becomes known as a pompier painter. Pompier means has double meaning in French. It means firefighter. So he was sort of famed for doing lots of the gold braid on helmets and and epaulettes and so forth. So he's famous for doing his detail of military honors and insignia and uniforms and so forth.
Because he had the experience.
Yeah, and I'm always interested the way he was denigrated for that. But then, of course, you'll find that those same critics would praise artists who described nature in such a detailed way. So I'm interested as to why there is a distinction between nature and uniforms and so forth. I think it seems to be a form of snobbery. But anyway, so Meissonier is a fantastically famous salon painter. Gets loads of honors, gets loads of awards, but pompier also means pompous. So he becomes denigrated as a pompous painter, and so he becomes a target of the Impressionists and so forth.
Are you going to the next painting?
Yeah. So that last painting was called The Card Game. This is called The End of the Card Game. So this is what happens when the card game goes wrong.
Cards is truly something to fight over when somebody pulls a 5th ace out of their sleeve. Yeah.
This is no good. This is terrible. Now,
what do you mean?
This is painting.
What do you mean? This is terrible.
This is just boring. This is a boring.
No.
This is enough. This is enough painting. This is an epic painting.
What would Ruskin say?
Yeah, what would Ruskin say about it?
Oh, he would say it's very respectable, but he doesn't mean that in a good way.
Okay, we're gonna have to get you and D to do like an art stream together, and we need to promote it like a prize fight. You know, I'll be like Don King or whatever, and I'll go and like get everyone to to put on a bet, and we'll.
It's going to be like the sort of it's going to be like Warhol versus Basquiat.
Yeah,
they promoted that like a boxing match.
Exactly.
So this is a preview of what's going to happen at the event in August. I think there's going to be violence. There's going to be smoking of cigars and violence.
This almost happened between Sargon and Columba, didn't it?
Oh, yes, it did. Actually.
I mean, it very nearly came to blows.
Yes, that was quite fiery.
Yeah, it did get fiery. I mean, I have to say there's a lot more kind of life to this, but I think that's because you're painting like the aftermath of a fight in a dusky evening. Blood has been spilled, the men are tired and wounded. Whereas in the other one, it's a kind of more gentile, sort of daytime scene, maybe outside a tavern or, they're just having a friendly game so far. Although the man on the right is clearly some kind of barren card shark sort of thing that you see in Regency novels all the time. So,
well, you see, if he was a typical Victorian painter, he'd show that a little card hidden in his stocking. You see,
yeah, that's right. He's called like the Baron de Pontmercy or something, and he's like a notorious card cheater.
Yes. I mean, you can see the face. He's just seen their hand, and he's seriously annoyed.
He is annoyed because he's lost like 4 hands out of 5, and he knows what's going on. I mean, he's
going to go out to the back and shoot himself.
There was a common system that was developed by which these kind of aristocratic cheaters would have like a manservant who would pour drinks at the table, and while they were pouring a drink for the opposite player, they had these like subtle like symbols that they would like as they poured the jug, they would hold up say 3 fingers, or they would move their index finger in a certain way that meant clubs or spades or whatever, and they would indicate how many there were, or say the lowest or highest hand or whatever. Very, very complex system that was used in this period for this sort of thing.
Oh, by the way, Gio in the chat is offering to set up a wrestling match between Pharaoh and D.
Yeah,
on I would channel. Definitely lose. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, you're both very tall. I think you're actually slightly taller than D, but I think D has got like.
He's weightier than me. He's got the additional stones.
He's like a prize fighter nowadays. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, right. I think maybe we should move on to the next one, just due to time. So here we have Bergerot, Adolf William Bergerot, I believe. So this is his self-portrait. Working in the same period. So Tom. Let's have a look at what I've copy pasted.
Now, I have actually heard from many people who despise this painter. They absolutely loathe him. They loathe his works. They call them sentimental, crowd-pleasing. Some of them even describe them as pedophilic in their taste. And because of course am I correct in thinking that he was basically a kind of very popular painter among both the public and the press throughout his life?
So Bergerot, working from so he was born in 1825, died in 1905, spanned the period of the Victorian period in France, obviously. Hugely popular, made paintings that were fantastic stormers at the salon. They got good reviews. They sold to the upper class. They sold to aristocracy. They sold to just the wealthy middle class. Got good reviews. Depended a lot on nudity and sort of grace, I would say. They were denigrated, you'll not be surprised to hear, by the Impressionists, who came up with this term bourgeoisie, which meant to make paintings as smooth and as polished as furniture.
Yes.
That's not the world's best takedown, if I'm honest with you, but come on, you've had Ruskin giving his all smooth like furniture.
I have to say, whenever I look at again, I understand that this still takes an enormous amount of talent and time to make works like this. But whenever I look at his paintings, I feel kind of like sickly. That I feel like I've just eaten too much sugar. Like it's just too chocolate boxy. Like it's just. Like it's so kind of delicate and almost twee, I think. At least to me, maybe I'm just viewing it through a cynical modern lens. I don't know.
Someone needs to tweet Mr. D and at him and find out what he thinks.
Mr. D hates.
Okay, so we know. Okay.
He also calls some of the paintings pedophilic in the way they depict cherubs and children and things.
Yeah. So anyway, the point is why we're discussing this is because Bergerot, if you want to move to the next image, was hugely successful not least because, of course, of all the nudity and so forth. He was the quintessential academic painter,
Yes.
appreciated by critics.
Do you think that he was maybe, shall we say, using quite gratuitous classical nudity to basically increase his profile and increase the price and the fame of his works among buyers?
I would say that's a fair assessment. Whether or
Okay.
not that invalidates the art is a
No,
different
no.
question.
I
But
don't
I
believe
think
it.
I think
Yeah.
your point is correct. Yes.
I think it might cheapen it if that is true. Farah, what do you make of it?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of this. I thought the previous one was pretty good. I didn't know much about him beforehand. I think this is quite graceful and good composition. This is horrible, and like you said, it's just like an obvious feast of flesh. It's not sensual. It's just bait basically, and you can compare this to something like a Jerome bathing scene or something like that, where it's just so much more beautifully and subtly done.
Yes.
Or the Turkish bath by Agra. You remember the circular one that we looked at, which was basically he was basically testing to see if he could fill out the entire picture full of naked female
women.
flesh.
I would say that even that was better than this. This again, there's some big disconnects with each of the figures, and I think it's meant to merely to titillate, as opposed to be sensual or focus on beauty. Personally, so not a fan.
Now, I've also heard that accusation leveled at Peter Paul Rubens.
No,
I don't think the two are really comparable.
No.
I think Rubens was basically an eroticist in the kind of metaphysical sense, whereas this feels just a little bit cheap in how it's presenting itself.
I think there again, it's something that's really hard to say, and I can only say that it's something that you pick up from looking at a lot of paintings, etc. But there is a fine line between, like you said, eroticism and just cheapness. And I think this definitely crosses over. Like there's just a whole load of individual people and places set up in very provocative ways, as opposed to like there's always mystery in the eroticism of Rubens, if that makes sense. Well, I feel like everything's on show here, and there's nothing.
Definitely.
It's all out, and it's done in a way that's very, very provocative.
Now, according to 73 Elephants in the chat, Matisse was kicked out of the academy personally by Bouguereau, if that's how you say it. I don't know how to say it, but because of his inability to learn perspective.
That's quite possible. And Matisse went on to study under Moreau, who we've looked at quite a few times, and Matisse was very complimentary about Moreau, Gustave Moreau. It is quite possible that he'd had conflict with Bouguereau. Bouguereau was a high level teacher. He was sort of like one of the most sought after tutors or teachers in Paris in the second half of the 19th century. So he had a huge amount of influence as a teacher, which is I think if we move on, we'll get to his negative. It's his polar opposites. So this is interesting, not for what it is, but for who owned it. Can you guess who owned this painting, gentlemen?
Who owned it?
Yes,
Charles de Gaulle. He had it in his office behind him.
No.
Was it one of the mid-century Germans?
Oh, that's close. I thought you might go for that. Yeah. So it's not the mid-century Austrian painter. It was owned by a famous Spanish painter of the 20th century.
Was it our boy, our classic, our favorite one, Salvador Dali?
It was indeed. Congratulations. And this is currently hanging in the Figueras Museum of Dali. It was bought by Dali and owned by him. And he was a big fan of Bouguereau, of course, and of Meissonier.
Dali was really?
Yes. He was devoted to them. He said he was the Pompier painter of the 20th century.
the fact that is the most shocking thing I've learned maybe all week is the fact that Dali loved Bouguereau. I couldn't imagine to. I mean, that is genuinely a shock to me.
I was going to ask, there are some Gala paintings which have a similar pose to this. Do you think that was intentional?
Yes, well, I mean, it's sort of,
isn't it?
well, yes, it's derived from sort of salon painting and classical painting of the 19th century. Yes.
Okay.
So here is the polar opposite. Here is our boy.
Yeah.
Well, not our boy. Maybe we'll be doing a
we'll
stream
have
on
to
him
see,
in
because
future.
we haven't really talked about him yet, have we?
No.
I must. By the way, just sorry to keep interrupting. I think that we should definitely need Mr. D on for the Van Gogh stream, just because I've had many long conversations with him about that. He is extremely knowledgeable and has something of a personal connection to the art as well. I think that would greatly enrich. I know traditionally it's just us; we don't normally have guests, but I think just for that, it would be good to have Mr. D on. I think.
Yes, yeah, I'm a big fan of Mr. D. Also, Gio points out that Klimt was a big fan of sort of sensual depictions of women. You'll find, I mean, his paintings of women are quite interesting, and he also did lots of erotic drawings of women. So, yes, it's a good call out. So here is our boy, our future boy, Vincent van Gogh, famous Dutch painter, of course, as you all know, famously unsuccessful.
Yes.
So what you'll find is that if you look at his history, so Bouguereau and Meissonier, both extremely talented, famous, fated, they both became rich, of course. Van Gogh, not so much, of course, famously poor, and he was genuinely poor, although he did tend to spend his allowance rather hastily, spent a lot of money on alcohol and tobacco, and he did patronize brothels as well.
Well, I was going to say I've been there, but then you added the last one, so.
Oh, okay. So he was a sort of so he spent a relatively short amount of time at formal art school. So his formal art school training was about 1 year at the Royal Academy in Brussels in 1880 to 81, 2 months in the Antwerp Academy in 1886, and another 2 months or even less than 2 months at Cormon's Academy in Paris in 1886, which is where he met Toulouse-Lautrec, I believe. So this is a page from a book by Bargue. Charles Bargue wrote the academic textbook on anatomy. And so this was basically artists were copying these anatomy books. So they were learning to draw the outlines, and then they were also doing the shading in. When Van Gogh was at the two academies, he would have been basically stuck in the life room, stuck in the plaster cast room, which is the room that you had to go through. You had to spend a year in the plaster cast room drawing casts of bodies and also casts of antique sculpture before you were permitted to start drawing live bodies. That was different in the Paris academy that he went, the Paris school that he went to later.
Do you think that is a productive environment choice?
I think it's a good way of learning what classical art is and what artists have done before. It also focuses your ability to draw. I think basically if you could accelerate through those and show that you had learned, I think it's a good way of training.
Right, okay.
Yeah. As long as you're not stuck in it for too long, I think. Yeah. And also, if you understand that you both have to understand the masters, be able to imitate the masters, but also do something different. So if we go to the next one. So he spends a relatively little amount of time in the academy. So here is a skeleton smoking a cigarette. This was painted. I think he was in one of the anatomy rooms of the Antwerp Academy, I think it was. And he just basically stuck a cigarette in a skeleton's mouth, a skeleton's jaw.
That's marvelous. Yeah. I like that very much.
Yeah.
So just before we go on, what are you? So what are your general opinions of this painter as a whole?
Very highly. I tend to have difficulty with the early work and also the sort of the impressionist work. The later work, the very last works that was done over the last 18 months of his life, I think are absolutely stunning, and the drawings are amazing. He develops very rapidly, becomes a great artist from basically, you look at the early work and it looks practically incompetent, but he accelerates extremely fast. I know that some people like the early work as well. I'm not among that number. I also think the Impressionist works are actually the worst ones. Stuff he was doing in Paris in sort of 86, but then 87 when he moves to the 87 or 88, 87 when he moves to Arles. That's when his art really picks up, and I think in the last sort of 2 years of his life, he's an absolutely astonishing painter.
He also starts quite late, doesn't he? So he's one of those kind of like late bloomers, but he just produces so much work and works so hard. Like just from an industrious work ethic point of view, and someone who is totally committed to the Grail quest that is hunting of beauty that the artist goes upon. You know, I have to doff my cap. But I actually agree with Alex. You know, I think a lot of those later works are sublime and unlike anything.
We've been spammed.
We've got visitors. Do we
not,
have
not,
any
not
mods?
the good kind.
We have
No.
mods. Maybe
No.
make Lumberg or Amy a mod, and they could deal with it.
Yeah.
I'll have to. Apparently, they saw the Burgero stuff.
Oh yes, there you are. You see,
We mentioned brothels, and that brought them in.
Anyway, the reason why I chose Van Gogh is, of course, he's famously unsuccessful commercially. So here's some drawings of him by John Peter Russell, who's the Australian impressionist. Didn't paint very many pictures, or not many of his pictures survived, very sadly, because he was an extremely competent artist. It's interesting to get a view of Van Gogh, who looks extremely tough and vigorous. It's interesting that the wife of Theo, Van Gogh's brother, whose name is eludes me anyway. So she met the famous brother, who was sort of supposedly
a dealer, wasn't he?
Yes, he was an art dealer, and she married him, and she hadn't met Vincent. And then when Vincent turned up, he was supposed to be famously this sickly, ill person who'd been, basically I think he'd been in an asylum at that point. And then when she met him, she was amazed because he looked so much healthier than her husband, Theo. Theo, of course, died very quickly after Van Gogh. Sadly, I think it was about a year afterwards. Yeah. Anyway, so if we go on, Theo was supporting Van Gogh. Yeah. This painting is significant because I think it's practically the only oil painting that was sold during his lifetime.
Yes, because there's the famous piece of trivia that he never sold a painting in his life, which is not true, isn't it?
Yes, and it's also not true that he never sold. It's also not true that he only sold one picture. He did sell some watercolors and he sold some drawings. He was commissioned by sort of friends of the family and so forth when he was in the early years. And basically, he was selling all of his work, selling his work to his brother, because he was sending everything to his brother and saying, "You pay me my stipend, you pay me my monthly amount of money, and you will get these art, and we'll share the money, or you get to keep the money, you get to keep the paintings." So basically, he was selling all his art. He was just selling it to his brother.
Yeah.
But he was extremely unsuccessful in commercial terms.
Yes. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say what caused him to, because I don't know much about the story about how he kind of came to light.
It was Anna. I think is. I might have to know what's chat. What's the name of? Was it Anna?
Anna Bock, is it? You thinking?
Yes, Anna Bongen or something. Yeah, so this is basically what. So it was Theo got him some exhibitions. So he did get a significant exhibition right at the end of his life in 1890. So if you go to the next slide, this is basically a letter that he wrote to Monsieur Aurier. Aurier was an art critic for the Mercure, which was a French newspaper. I'll just read you a couple of extracts. So he wrote a really good, positive review in the Mercure de France of an exhibition, group exhibition of, I think it was Van Gogh and Gauguin and a couple of other symbolists. So he writes to Aurier. At this time, I think he's in the asylum at this stage. He's very sick. He's in the south of France. So he writes to Aurier in Paris saying, "Thank you very much for your article in the Mercure de Paris, Mercure de France, which greatly surprised me. I like it very much as a work of art in itself. I feel that you create colors with your words. Anyway, I rediscover my canvases in your article, but better than they really are, richer, more significant. However, I feel ill at ease when I reflect on what you have to say should be applied to others rather than me." And he goes on talking about all these other artists that he loves. So he talks about Monticelli, he talks about Watteau, he talks about Gauguin, who he's had a big falling out with, but who he still respects as an artist. So, famously, Gauguin ran away when Van Gogh turned up with his ear in a when he had a fight, he cut off his ear to give to a prostitute. And then he sort of staggered back to the home, and Gauguin said, quite understandably, "I'm out of here," and ran away.
Yeah, it's also the exactitudes of that story are quite are still in dispute a bit, aren't they? The whole thing with the ear and what exactly went on there. Yeah.
Anyway, so Van Gogh goes on, and in closing, I declare that I do not understand that you spoke of Meissonier's infamies. It is perhaps from the excellent fellow Mauve, who's a friend of his, a Dutch friend, that I've inherited a boundless admiration for Meissonier. Mauve was endless in his praise for Troyan and Meissonier, a strange combination. So there you are. Van Gogh was a fan of Meissonier. Unbelievable.
Interesting. So, I guess it does show that. I guess Van Gogh didn't really get hit by the critics hard. It's just that he didn't really manage to get.
He didn't get much attention at all. It was sorry. Just to finish off. So it's the 1890 exhibition, just a short exhibition that gets the great review. He replies to that to the critic saying, "Thank you very much." That's the one exhibition the big exhibition that he had. That's the place where he sold the one painting to Anna Bosch, and that's basically more or less the record of his sort of public exhibitions or public exposure at the time.
I think it also comes down to someone like Bouguereau is a kind of perfectly respectable kind of man, whereas Van Gogh was obviously I think something that Mr. D said was that he was actually a very abrasive personality, and he created a lot of his own problems by basically kind of refusing to play ball with anybody.
Yes, correct.
He would always kind of ruin things that were set up for him. And that obviously didn't help him at all, because nobody wanted to work with him or be charitable.
He was impossible. He was a big drinker. He was very irascible. He'd get into arguments over anything. He was impossible to work with. I can understand why people avoided him, but he was a brilliant painter as well. But there were lots of people who were supportive of him and his art, but quite wary about being around him because he was extremely difficult.
Mr. D also said that that kind of he thinks that he may have actually been partly autistic or have Asperger's or some kind of because he was so legendarily unreasonably difficult to even talk to, that he reckons that there must have been something a little bit up with him. And of course his kind of fixation with painting and work and in capturing certain things.
And also there was this question of his illness, which is obviously a big thing about what was his illness, what's the nature, was it a confluence of different things, was it lead poisoning? Was it alcoholism? Was it sort of some psychological condition? Was it some sort of neurological situation?
Clearly, it's just too much exposure to France.
Or was it syphilis? Because
well, I
his
mean,
brother,
he spent a
because
lot
his
of time
brother,
in brothels. You know?
yes, and his brother died of syphilis.
Yeah,
I'm not suggesting that anything happened between the two of them. But
No,
they
no.
were doing the same things and going to the same places.
they
That's
were
my point.
seeing the
They
same
weren't
ladies.
doing it with each other.
No,
just in parallel.
Yes.
That's a horrible
it's
thought,
very common disease at the time, of course.
Yes.
I would be very interested to know like how he manages to make his way into like the modernist canon, though, because again, like someone at some point.
Okay, I can tell you because Anna publishes the letters to Theo because she inherits because Theo was trying to set up an exhibition after Van Gogh's death. Didn't happen. He died very quickly. Van Gogh died in 1880. Theo died in 1891 in an insane asylum, but in terrible condition. And then the young widow, she had a child called Vincent, and she had this drawer full of letters, and she had basically rooms full of paintings. And she said basically, perhaps we'll publish these letters because it shows the devotion of these two brothers in this joint project. That expands his name. There are a few avant-garde critics who are keen on him. His work gets exhibited. It gets taken up, especially in Germany, and is sort of seen as the precursor to Expressionism. It influences Expressionism. Lots of German critics are excited by him. The letters are published in a book in sort of the 1910s or whatever. I think it came out just before the war in French and German, and then there's later an English translation. It's basically the letters which break him because they are so fantastic as a collection. And that sort of cements his reputation sort of critically.
There you go. Start any aspiring artists out there, start handwriting letters to your brother immediately to ensure your legacy. Okay, I think we're rounding up to the end of our stream. So thank you so much for that, Alexander. That was really interesting.
So generally then, I must now pose the question to the two of you, starting with Ferro. Is it better or worse for an artist to have critical acclaim or critical contempt? What in your mind is a better thing for an artist? Do artists need kind of celebration, or do they need hardline, do better, kind of encouragement? Shall we call it?
Yes, good question. Ruskin actually answered this, and he believed it should be encouragement as they're growing up, and then chastisement as they kind of start to blossom as an artist. But after that, once the artist kind of reaches his peak, he just doesn't give a crap about anyone else.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what the critic has to say. And I think that's a really interesting point as well, as like going back to the fundamental, what is the role of the critic? In my mind, the principal point is to guide the artist of the day, and to encourage some, to chastise others. Well, going back to the Whistler thing again, note that Whistler never ever again made a piece of work as abstract as that, and
so in a sense, Ruskin succeeded.
Exactly, he guided Whistler back to a path of
like a kamikaze plane. He brought down the ship in a blaze of glory.
Yes, he literally stopped the whole art of criticism as well. But I like that idea. I think artists, especially when they're young, that they're like beautiful, fragile flowers. You need to water them and to encourage them and to let them grow. And so I think you need to pull your punches. There's a line in Idylls of the King where Lancelot talks about how he would never joust with a new knight so that they can get their own fame and fortune themselves. Which I thought was quite beautiful and quite nice. I think it's important to give space to those people, but there is a point where they're a bit more established, and that's when the guidance, let's just say, can happen. But like I said, there's a point where criticism just becomes for the masses and becomes about fashion and respectability. I despise that.
Guardian level.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it's about. It's not even about trying to find something that's good. It's about being proper. This is what a fellow Guardianista does. We go to the good shows,
Yeah.
Anyway, Alex.
So yes, I now turn the same question over to you.
Okay, well, I would say that Ruskin was pretty much on the money. I would say also it's the role of family, tutors, art schools, and sort of friends of the family, as it were, to encourage the young artist. I don't think a young artist benefits from being exposed to professional art criticism before they leave college, or even much before they're sort of 25 or so. Mm-hmm. So I would say keep them away from that. Allow them to develop their own style and their own thinking and their own range of references. Then once they become more public figures, then they should be exposed to more criticism and harsher criticism. But of course, yeah, you're right. At some point, successful artists just don't care because they've got money. They're interestingly enough, they're kind of locked into a style. They can't, if they get good criticism, they can't really act on it because it might involve them changing their style radically, and they've already got their collectors and their fans and stuff are already expecting a certain style of work from them. So it's very difficult to change course once you're established. So that's also a good reason why artists tend to ignore critics, even though they might be right at a sort of mid-stage of their career.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about the artist as a careerist and having to think about his patrons and stuff. So no, that's fascinating. Okay. That was really interesting. Any last points on the critic? Hat?
I think learned, intelligent critics are good, but they can't just be like Guardian level, sort of like snipe makers. They've got to be learned in many ways. They have to be learned in the art itself. They have to be learned in kind of the philosophy around it. Like, for example, Baudelaire, we will always remember his writings on art. We probably won't remember the Parisian columnist of 1878 or whatever, who wrote about whatever. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, we remember those who actually contribute meaningfully to our understanding of art and to our understanding of kind of periods of art. However, I would say, just to clear this up as a point in case anyone's wondering, I don't believe a good critic has to be skilled in the field that they're actually critiquing. In my experience, I've seen enough people who know everything about a field, head to tail, and can tell you everything about it and make very intelligent statements about it. But if they try to put pen to paper or brush to canvas, it would fail completely. Some people are just built to analyze without being able to do. It's rather controversial, but that's one of my opinions on Ezra Pound, is that he was actually, compared to the others of his age, he was actually quite a mediocre poet, but he had an understanding of poetry that was almost unrivaled by anybody ever, I think. So, he was responsible for launching the many careers of many poets, and also to deciding what was good and what was bad. But he will probably be remembered more for that than for his actual poems themselves. So yes, that's what I would say about that.
One thing I wanted to reflect on a second is around Van Gogh and the idea of the undiscovered artist, and I do wonder if there are actually more undiscovered artists than we think. And one thing I think people should put time and effort into is pulling the threads of time and having a look through things in the past to try and discover artists. That there's been a few moments of that recently. Did you see the Shazowski? I can't say his name. You must have seen this, Alexander, on Netflix. The DiCaprio documentary about that Polish sculptor.
No, that hasn't crossed my radar.
It's called Struggle.
Okay. Well, I would say yes, Pharaoh. You're sort of correct. Well, actually, you are largely correct. So I would say mention Vermeer. People think of Vermeer, 17th century Dutch painter from Delft, and of course hugely world famous now. Very small Louvre, about sort of 43 paintings or so. He was basically forgotten from the time of his death until the end of the 19th century, and he was rediscovered by a critic and promoted by a critic. And of course, now we think of him as being part of the canon. He's an absolutely essential artist. Everyone has to know him. But you go back to 1850, no one would have heard of him. It was only one art critic called Torre who was a big promoter of his stuff, and that was one of the reasons why he became. There was an interest in him that revived. Also, there's a cottage industry of reviving artists amongst feminist art historians. So basically, they go back through history, and every female artist who's ever put paint to canvas and whose name is known has basically been revived or been re-examined or been given a book or whatever. So it's a cottage industry for feminist art historians. The role of the critic's quite important. I would say it's kind of difficult to define. I would say also I'd agree with Hat in that some people are born to be teachers, for example, and they may be brilliant teachers, but they're not necessarily the best artists themselves. So,
yes.
Also, I'd like to thank the chat for interacting and being so lively and getting some really good comments.
Yes, thanks to everyone down there.
It was Suklowski is the name, and it's on Struggle. It's on Netflix. Would highly recommend it. I think we're in a real age of rediscovering artists. So I think that's what we need to focus on. We need to have a new wave of criticism to judge what's around, but we also need people researching and looking up things and rediscovering things of the past. It's kind of like art archaeology in some kind of ways, and you do get that with various. What one guy is Oradimos on Twitter. He kind of mines out stuff from those old art journals from the 19th century and digs out really interesting people you wouldn't have necessarily heard of before. So
excellent.
Would highly recommend. Okay, let's finish there. Thank you guys so much. That was a really interesting discussion on criticism. Now, speaking of criticism, let's talk about the plugs. So, Alexander, there's just so many books, so many things happening right now. What can you buy?
Well, at the moment, you can buy my book on Degas. It's published. It's published worldwide. I think now. I think it becomes available in America in the middle of this month. So sort of there's a difference between the publication dates, but that will be available very soon. So basically, by the time, you can get in your pre-orders now, even if you can't get it until next week. My book Artivism has been. The first copies have gone out. Officially, you can't buy it until the 2nd of August, but you can get in pre-orders if you go to a bookshop or to any book-selling website or the website of Imprint Academic with the publishers. Artivism, the Battle for Museums in the Era of Postmodernism. It is my longest and most spicy book so far.
Indeed.
Where's
the best place to buy it to give you the most money, though?
DM me on Twitter and I'll send you a signed copy. That's the best way, but you can get it anyway. And also I will be bringing copies to the event. So if you're interested and you think you can hold off until then, see me at the event and I will be able to sell you a signed copy.
Excellent. And Mr. Hat, the Industrious as well.
Yes. I have several books, as I say, usually coming out this summer. I have no no mark whatsoever on the industriousness, the Balzacian scribbling of Alexander Adams. The speed at which he can do it astounds me. So yes, my laggardly ways. My first project will be with Imperium Press. I'm doing the introduction and annotations to a book of poetry, which will be kind of English, great English poems, which is meant to be the kind of like pocket-sized right-wing anthology of poems, basically. Like it's the one I expect to see everyone carrying with them. It'll fit in your pocket. You can take it with you everywhere. You can carry this great piece of our cultural tradition with you wherever you go. It will be hardcover. It'll be quality. It'll be a true something to pass down to your children. Like Palgrave's treasury. It'll be incredible. And then the next thing is I'll have a book of my own poetry coming out with them as well. I have a novel coming out, publisher to be decided. And as well, I'll be bringing out several smaller books on philosophy, as well as, of course, The Authentic Reactionary, which is my kind of definitive statement on reactionary philosophy and the ideal forms of it and where it comes from and where it will go.
That sounds more productive than me.
Well, yeah, it's the thing, but at a snail's pace. I work on things simultaneously, and I'm very laggardly. Yes, these will probably take much longer than I'm hoping they will.
Oh, congratulations!
Yes, I will. The thing is, I was researching Balzac recently, and I was wondering if I could take up his regimen, which involved working at night, wearing a monk's robe for clothing, and drinking an absurd amount of Turkish coffee all the time to go for like marathon 9-hour writing stretches, where he can finish like a novel in 2 weeks, on this intense diet of like French food and coffee.
You do know that he died at the age of 51.
Well, I'm aware, but I wouldn't have to do it all my life. I could do it for a brief time just to get things finished quickly. Yes, I have to try something like that.
Hat, don't kill yourself by drinking. Okay, excellent. Please also follow Alexander Adams and Panama Hat on Twitter, although I guess Panama's more active. And also just tune in occasionally. I normally do kind of like a message whenever Alex is on GP News. You have to see his last interview. It's great.
You do.
The banter levels are excellent.
Magnificent interview.
The crowd were lapping it up. That's all I'm saying. Just it was very entertaining.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's call a close on tonight's proceedings. We'll catch up.
Are we gonna tell them to destroy that like button?
Oh, I forgot. Yes.
Stomp that subscribe button.
Yes, maybe leave a comment about your favourite critic or your thoughts on what makes the archetypal critic. It would be really interesting to hear, and we'll mention it in the next live stream. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening, and good night.